welcome to our 36 by 36 Associations podcast. Today I will be speaking with Riane Eisler. She is a famous person. She is the recipient of the Distinguished Peace Leadership Award, earlier given to the Dalai Lama, and she is internationally known for her groundbreaking contributions as a system scientist, as a futurist, as a historian, and I believe as a feminist. She is the author of the famous The Chalice and the Blade and had 57 printings in the US and 30 foreign editions. She's also the author of The Real Wealth of Nations, hailed by the Nobel Peace Laureate Desmond Tutu as a template for the better world we have been so urgently seeking. And she has more recently written the book Nurturing Our Humanity. Her writings and her pioneering work offers a really important new perspective for constructing less violent and more egalitarian, gender-balanced and sustainable future societies. I'm happy to welcome Riane Eisler. Welcome to this podcast series of the 36 by 36 Association. It's episode number 2, and I am welcoming the famous Riane Eisler, who I admire very, very much. Welcome, Riane.
Well, thank you so much, my dear. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And the first question that I'm going to ask you, if you look with your life experience at the world of today, it may be hopeful or it may be difficult. But, with the climate change, with the situation in the world, with, I would say, authoritarian regimes, but also with the many, many people who are active, trying to transform the world, trying to change the world. What would you recommend to a 13-year-old girl?
I thought about that question. 13 is such a great age because you're becoming aware at that age more than you were before. I would say to a 13-year-old girl, believe in yourself, make your voice heard, and realize that you and your leadership will be essential. So yes, familiarize yourself with the world as it is, but image the world as it can be, as it should be, and work for that. And don't believe everything you're told.
That's great. That's fantastic. If I take you back, I have, of course, read at least 2 of your books, The Chalice and the Blade and The Wealth of Nations. And let me take you to The Chalice and the Blade. And I'm explaining why. I think it is actually, I believe, a must-read history book that should be in all schools, yes, definitely. And why? Because it is so thorough and it's so wide, but it also has a very, very strong theory behind, looking at the world, with a completely different lens. And I would like to take you back when you started writing the book, when you started thinking about the cultural transformations theory that is, very much part of the book. What brought you to discover the world from that lens?
Well, I sometimes say that my life is like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together. First of all, when I was a child refugee with my parents from Nazi Austria, where I was born. And while I witnessed cruelty on Crystal Night and violence, gang of Gestapo men came to her home and dragged my father off, I also witnessed something very important. And that is what I today call spiritual courage. And my mother displayed that courage. She recognized one of the guys that came, one of the Nazis, as a young man who had been a former errand boy for the family business, and she got furious. Now, she could have been killed. I mean, many Jewish people were killed that night, but by a miracle, she wasn't. She said to him, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you? I want him back." By a miracle, some money eventually passed hands, of course, but she did get him back. And we were refugees, my parents and I, to Havana, to Cuba, where I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana. So that's where I witnessed still another form of structural violence, really the enormous gaps between haves and have-nots at that time in Cuba. And all this led me to questions. And these are the questions that I think many of us have asked. Does it have to be this way? When we humans have such a capacity for sensitivity, for caring, for really creativity, because my mother was creative, why has there been so much destructiveness and violence and cruelty? And these were the questions that my work sought to answer many years later, of course. I think that it's very important to realize that we have alternatives. And my research, of course, shows, yes, there is an alternative, but you cannot see it through the lenses of conventional thinking, through conventional categories like right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist. For one thing, because there have been repressive, violent regimes in all these categories, if you really think about it. So none of us tells us what we have to build. Moreover, and this is really fundamental, if you really think about these categories and you think about conventional education, conventional studies of societies, they either marginalize or ignore the majority of humanity, women and children. And that is fatal. I mean, I'm a systems scientist, and I learned very early. I worked for an offshoot of the Rand Corporation at a time when systems analysis was just in its infancy. You have to look at the whole system, for goodness sakes. And that's what I did.
And this is so interesting because what I found interesting about the book in terms of how I reread it, because I told you I read it 20 years ago and now I reread it. And what I found so interesting is there is such a difference between a narrative that says, yes, we have an alternative, we can do differently, but it has never happened in history, or a narrative where we can say there is evidence that in the history of humankind, there was a period of peace and egalitarian societies, or, kind of distribution economies. We don't know all the details, but there is enough, if we look at the research, if we look at the science, there is enough evidence that the warlike state, the dominance that has developed is a certain period of the history of humankind, but not the entire history of humankind. And what impact does that have on people when you talk about this to other people?
What impact does it have? Well, it depends. Some people, I get a lot of feedback. I've always known this somehow inside of me. And yes, what you have provided in your work is a way of connecting dots, huge dots. I mean, immense dots, obviously, you know, when you talk about the majority of humanity and family as being very important, gender as being very important. But I just didn't have the way to do it. That's one reaction. Another reaction is total rejection, total disbelief. I mean, because
Interesting.
we have been so indoctrinated. And I mean, education, unfortunately, it does not include this information yet, as a rule.
It's so true.
And it's up to us to see that it does. Now, another reaction is to completely misinterpret what I'm saying, to think that I'm talking about ideal societies. No, they're not ideal, but as you said, they were more peaceful, they were more gender balanced, which is something that we really don't think of as a social issue. In fact, it is not a quote women's issue. It is, I mean, yeah, it affects women, but it also does terrible things to men. I mean, it is
Absolutely.
yeah, it is really vital. So it is like people think, well, that somehow this is just a utopia. In fact, I coined a new term called pragmatopia.
Ah,
Place. Well, because utopia means no place, right? An impossible place. And as long as we think it's not possible, I mean, this is the point. The period of domination being in the mainstream. Maybe I have to back up and talk about what I discovered before I go into all of this. But the configuration that began to be evident when I really put aside conventional ways of looking at society, what I began to see repeating itself historically, cross-culturally, were two social configurations. There were no names for them, so I called one the dominator or domination system, and the other one the partnership system. And that configuration shows the importance of parts of the social system that are really, as I said, marginalized or just ignored in conventional approaches in sociology and political science, in economics, etc. And that is, of course, where we all live, family and other intimate relations, and shows the relationship between what kind of relations, gender relations, childhood, parenting, etc., and also the kind of society, whether it's authoritarian, whether it's warlike, or in contrast, whether it is more peaceful, not perfect. But there are no signs in the archaeological record of destruction through war until at most 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, which is a blip in human cultural evolution.
it is actually. It's a short period of time. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
So, but it's interesting that you say some people completely reject it. I've had the same experience, say, this is just a storybook. And other people saying, yeah, I've known this all along. And it is so interesting, but you do give a lot of substance to it. And I do think by now, even though there is a different narrative, there is a narrative of, humankind has always been like this. War is the father of everything, and things like that. This narrative is very, very strong, but at the same time, there is so much evidence. I mean, I've of course also have been reading the books of Maria Gimbutas, which is absolutely fascinating up to the detail, how these cultures, actually existed in a peaceful and, as you said, not perfect way, but in a peaceful way. So I believe it is so absolutely important to say it's not about going back to that time, because we don't want to go back 6,000 years, but it's good to
we know the
know.
configuration.
Yeah, it's good to know, that we had a period where this was possible, because that makes it possible in the future.
And it's beyond that, really knowing the kind of configuration, social configuration we need to really meet the enormous challenges we face today, all the way from climate change and regression to authoritarianism and this chronic injustice that we see all around us. You can't fix that by just putting on little band-aids, really, on the existing system. You need whole systems transformation. Now, the good news is that there are many trends in that direction, but they're not emphasized in the conventional conversation. And
wonderful. Now we're getting there. We're getting towards what we call life-serving economies, or I even in my books and in my articles, I call it life economies. So it means that describing that actually the purpose of economies should be to serve life. That should be the major purpose, and then people and planet, it's all part of it. But now that you say it is the social configuration that is so important that we should not neglect. What would you say from your experience, also, like capturing, what you've been writing in The Wealth of Nature? What are the key elements?
Petra, it's the real wealth of nations.
The real wealth of nations. The real wealth of nations. Sorry, yes, absolutely.
They have words on Smith's famous Wealth of Nations.
Yeah. We don't want to mix it up, although it's interesting. It would be interesting to compare. But if you had to summarize it, what are the let's say the must-haves for a future economy?
Well, first of all, we have. I'll backtrack a little bit. There's a big argument now between, as you know, capitalism and socialism. That is a distraction, because while both challenged some elements of what I call domination economics, which go way back to Chinese emperors and Arab sheiks and Indian pashas, it isn't just neoliberalism, okay? I mean, trickle-down economics, obviously, is sort of a replay of the feudal system, right? Where those on bottom were literally supposed to content themselves with the scraps falling from the opulent tables on top. I mean, it's kind of obscene. But the first thing that we really have to realize is that both capitalist and socialist theory perpetuated what I call a gendered system of values. Now, this has nothing to do with anything inherent in women and men. But what happens is that for both Smith and for Marx, and therefore for these two theories, caring for nature, for our natural life support systems, is absent. I mean, nature is there to be exploited, period. As for caring for people, starting at birth, that was supposed to be done for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. I also have a background as an attorney. My work is very multidisciplinary, which it has to be, to connect the dots, okay? Not these silos, where people don't know how to connect the dots again. For both of them, well, even as late as when Marx wrote, in the late 1800s, in most places, a wife, a woman, and most women were wives, could not sue for injuries inflicted on her. I mean, I know this as an attorney because of my background. Only her husband could, for loss of her services. It was just that embedded.
Amazing.
But, yes, well, so what the first element that we need is a complete economic map that recognizes the importance of the three life-sustaining sectors: the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy. We have metrics like GDP, which reflect the absence of counting the economic value, which is exponentially growing as we move into the post-industrial era, which is exponentially growing as we see climate change and the disaster for not caring for nature, for our life support systems, and the enormous poverty to the majority of humanity primarily, but also to men, caused by not counting caring work as economically valuable unless it's in the market. So that's the first element. The second element is we really have to think of what kind of rules should govern business. And that means, because economics don't just spring up in a vacuum, they're part of a larger social system, like families are, like education is, like religion is. So we really have to change the value system. What is value? That's what economics is about.
Absolutely.
Really. And of course, we not only need to have business policies, corporate charters, etc., reflect this, but we also need government policies. I mean, if anything was shown by the COVID-19 pandemic, is we need both. You know, yes, it would be nice if we had a free market. We don't. You know, we have incredible monopolies. Most people aren't even aware that, for example, diapers, which are essential, you know, essentials, there are two companies that control that market, about 80%.
Oh, I didn't know that.
No, you didn't know that because we are not told that. So we need caring government policies. But again, there are trends in that direction. I mean, most Northern European nations have universal health care. Caring. The nations that have actually moved most to the partnership configuration in Europe, nations like Finland, Sweden, Norway, they also have very generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers. They have subsidies, not just tax breaks, for childcare, so that childcare is valued both in families and we have a ways to go with that, really. So we need economic inventions that value the most important human work, which is caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems, which I have to emphasize we're trying to tack on to completely antiquated. I mean, look, both capitalism and socialism, they came out of the 1700s and 1800s. We're now in the 21st century post-industrial era. So on that count alone, they're antiquated, but because they perpetuate this gendered system of values, they're disastrous.
Absolutely. So you've been just mentioning that we need to completely shift the values of, you know, what is being valued. What in your view could be a narrative, you know, that makes it easier for people to understand it and not just put it into what they would call utopia or dreaming or unnecessary, or, you know, like, do you have any ideas or experiences what would shift that narrative?
Well, I think that the only way to shift that narrative, and I deal with this a great deal in my most recent book, Nurturing Our Humanity, The subtitle is How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future. The only effective way is to really focus on four cornerstones, and economics, moving to what in the Real Wealth of Nations I call a caring economics of partnerism, which obviously very much is sort of the same kind of idea as your life-sustaining economics. It's one of the cornerstones, but they're all interconnected. Childhood, we know now that genes is not the point. It's gene expression, and that it depends on the interaction of our brains, because we're not formed. We don't start with fully formed brains as humans. The architecture of our brains is created in interaction with our environment, which for humans is mostly cultural, right? So we have to have this whole systems shift. Gender. We've got to stop thinking of gender as just a women's issue. I've mentioned that, and I will emphasize it. Yes, I mean, the effect on women has been very bad, but consider that really there always seems to be money for prisons, right? You know, the male, sort of the archetype of the punitive male head of household, right? Or for weapons and wars, but and we need. I mean, I'm a Holocaust survivor. My goodness, in a world where there are so many regimes that orient more to domination, to the configuration, than to the partnership configuration. But you know, I mean, the United States is bizarre in its wasteful investment in weaponry, in the prison industry, which is huge. These are not necessary, but somehow this gender system of values, there isn't enough money for caring for people in the United States, you know, healthcare, childcare, paid parental leave. I mean, you have to really look at this. Now, there are trends, obviously, even in the United States. I mean, Biden, he started to use a term that I actually coined, well, two terms I coined. One is human infrastructure, you know, which is the main infrastructure for the post-industrial era, obviously. But also caring economics, even though he only uses it to describe direct care, it's a start.
Okay,
You know?
I wasn't aware of that. This is an interesting start. I had a conversation today with somebody who was talking about, he's the president of the World Academy of Arts and Science, Gary Jacobs. I don't know if you know him, but he was talking about completely redefining what human security is, and that human security is so naturally defined, you know, in relation to protection from war or to protection from natural disasters, etc. But that actually human security is much more embedded in care for each other and in peaceful societies. So you know, it means that our entire investment into weaponry, you know, is actually causing the next problem that weaponry tries to solve. So that's I thought that was quite an interesting hint.
Yeah. Well, I think that's wonderful. I'm a member of the World Academy, and I'm really pleased because I have stopped being active in it because, frankly, all of these discussions on education and economics didn't focus on what I think is important and what my research shows is important. Yeah. But so I'm delighted to hear that Gary. I mean, I spoke there, and some of the people liked it, but you know what happens is that I give a lot of keynotes and people get very enthusiastic, but then they get dragged back. And that's the reward system. That's the value system. They get dragged back to the old thinking.
that happens. And now I would like to kind of pick your brain here, because
Okay.
I mean, one of the goals of the 36 by 36 association is not only to feature women and to connect their knowledge and you know, their future thinking and their expertise, but it is also creating that net of relationships where there is mutual supporting each other in order to really, you know, even if it's small steps, but shift that reality and shift that perception and the lens with which we look at reality. So if you look at, if you look forward into the future and say, these are the things that actually need to happen, exactly what you say, that neither men nor women fall back into the old system, which is so attractive in the sense of habit, but also attractive in the sense of incentives, you know, like because
Oh, yeah. The
yeah,
reward
because
system is
it
a reward
operates,
system.
you know, with an incentive system of fitting in, you know, rather than not fitting in. But
And
if you look into the future and say, what is it that needs to happen to shift the discourse, shift the way looking at reality, shift people to what you say, not utopia, but you said pragmatopia, yeah,
yeah.
and to a narrative of, I would say, a narrative of possibility. Any ideas that you have, you know, what needs to happen in the world?
Well, first of all, if we are, let's focus for a moment on only economics, which we know, of course, isn't only economics, because the family, how, you know, the gendered system of values, the stories, the narratives, the language affect it. But the first thing that we would need to do is to create new metrics, because GDP and GNP are the direct result of both capitalist and socialist theory, really ignoring the three life-sustaining sectors of the economy. It's just not part of the economic map. As any economist, that's just reproductive work. And that's still being taught in econ schools rather than, quote, productive work, which is crazy. So we at the Center for Partnership Systems have been working, well, in 2014, we launched an attempt, it was sort of the first attempt, of alternative metrics that show the economic value of the work of caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems. And now, because there were 52 of these indicators, which is a lot, we have a group of economists, and we really need support, financial support, to develop this. And I am thinking of how, I mean, a lot of change depends on monetary resources, you know, on being able to develop these things.
Yeah,
But
that is
we're
so true.
developing a social wealth index, really combining, and it is related to the SEGs, you know, to the United Nations. What are they called? The
The
the one,
sustainable development goals.
SDGs. I get acronyms totally mixed up sometimes because there's so many of them. So that we are developing the social wealth index to show again that, for example, for the post-industrial era, economists keep saying, oh, the most important capital is, quote, human capital. And I hate that term, but it's a common term. You know, I prefer human infrastructure if we must talk about it. Well, but neuroscience shows, and this is all in Nurturing Our Humanity, in this book that my most recent books, which was published by Oxford University Press in, I guess, in 2019 or 20, something like that. And we know that whether we have these resilient people, creative people, people who can work in teams rather than just giving or taking orders, largely hinges on the quality of care and education children receive in the first 5 years of life. Well, that's women's work, right? And it's been devalued. So we've got to really stand, in Chalice, I have 2 chapters called Reality Stood on Its Head. And I always think our job is to stand reality right side up.
Absolutely. So in metrics, I think a lot is happening in metrics, but the interesting thing is that there are so many different metrics for sustainability and well-being developed that it's probably time to harmonize and to bring them together in order to have a very strong stance as an alternative to GDP. I do think people are open, and some even governments are open. I don't know if you're aware about the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the Wellbeing Government. So there is really something happening, but it's not yet a breakthrough. That I find quite interesting. So if we look at another lens of let's say, elements that may be part of the dominance model, but also part of the future, and that is laws and regulations. What do you think about what's the role of laws and regulations to actually shift?
Well, look, I mean, as I said, we not only need caring business charters and caring business, let me say that these things are all interconnected. I mean, when Biden, for example, proposed a minimum tax, structure that would be universal, actually a maximum tax structure, excuse me, for corporations, it has to be a global effort. And it's very difficult to get places like Andorra or what have you, that only exist because they're tax havens for mega corporations, for monopolies, really. We have to change that. And the only way to change that is through legislation. But how do you get the buy-in? And how do you have, the United Nations was supposed to do that, but obviously the membership of the United Nations, much of which consists of, I have to say it, authoritarian domination states, isn't going to even vote for that, much less put teeth in it. So we're right back to the 4 cornerstones of, yes, doing the short-term work, changing corporate charters, changing the metrics. But what we're really talking about is a cultural shift from the domination elements that we've inherited, and they're just part of the bread we eat and the soup we consume, and we have to become aware of them. And the only way to do that is to have a completely new frame, a completely new worldview, and then focus on these long-term interventions.
Yeah, I'm fully agreeing with you, and that's why I'm asking you. The last very important question now. Imagine you were elected by 10 million women to lead, to be the chair of a council, and you get all the power that you can ever get, kind of really authorized, by 10 million women to do the right steps. What would be your first steps in your first 90 days?
I would really focus a lot of attention on shifting parenting, the way we look at gender, the way we look at economics would be a top priority, actually. Because once you change the reward system, you really have a huge incentive. I mean, why don't we penalize those who harm life? GDP includes activities that take not only harm, but take life. I mean, selling cigarettes, the resulting medical costs, the resulting funeral costs, they make GDP go up. And as for nature, you know, trees are only represented in GDP, even though we need them. We need forests to breathe when they're dead. I mean, it's nuts. It really is a completely. So what I would say to you is, it isn't just a question of 10 million women delegating this to me. I'd love that. But it's also what kind of funding would they provide? Because we're really back. Now, fortunately, there are a lot of people who want a different system, but they don't know what it is. And this is where this work comes in, because it really does show that it is possible, but that we have to pay attention to areas that have been marginalized or ignored.
Yeah, thank you. Now, the last question is, now we are building this 36 by 36 association. We are saying women need to be the architectures of future economies. We're not saying there are not a lot of men with really good and brilliant expertise. That's not the issue. But it is a different way of bringing and networking women and networking women's and female expertise, and also a female reference system, because looking at caring, is a very strong, looking at life is a very strong female reference system. What would you recommend to us as the 36 by 36 association for, let's say, the next year or the next couple of years?
Well, I think it's very important for people to have this new worldview, this new conceptual framework. And I would strongly recommend, for example, online courses, because you are global, your network, on partnership studies. Because look, I mean, I introduced the concept of a caring economics of partnerism, but it's an outline, really, with some detail. We need to develop it together. And there's something else that you are working on, Petra, which I really like, is the understanding that we can all be leaders. We have been disempowered, and we need to regain that power, not, in terms of the chalice and the blade, not the blade power, the power to dominate, to control, to take life, but the power of the chalice, which is the power to give life, to nurture life, to really illuminate life. I mean, I think that we have to make a distinction between religion as it developed in domination times and the core teachings, which are caring for people. I mean, it's really fascinating when you come right about it. All the wisdom, but there's this overlay. I have an article in the magazine called Cosmos on bringing together people from world religions, scholars, to really sort out the partnership from the grain from the chaff, the partnership from the domination teachings, identify them, understand why they became part of our heritage, and then switch.
Shift the narrative and shift it completely over to the other side, because I think it is a pendulum, and I think it can go to the other side for a while until it goes into the middle.
I think we have a huge opportunity, but we need new language. Now, I really want to end with that. Linguistic psychologists have long told us that the categories provided by a language channel our thinking. Yes. So it's almost impossible. I mean, a colleague of mine calls the conventional right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, etc., capitalist, communist, socialist. She calls them weapons of mass distraction because they fragment our consciousness. That's why I coined new words like not only partnership system and domination system, but hierarchies. When you get to complex societies, you need loci of responsibility. Well, I mean, you need them everywhere. You need parents, you need teachers, you need managers, you need leaders, but there's a difference between what I call hierarchies of domination. We all know these. You know, I mean, you better obey or else, right? You're in trouble. You can even be killed. And hierarchies of actualization. I mean, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here, so to speak. We need new language. And when I talk about instituting classes, we actually have a very good course online at the Center for Partnership Systems with 4 videos, where we are, how we got here, you know, where we started our conversation. Then about who we really are, drawing from my already predicting some of my work in neuroscience, you know, because I'm a generalist, I'm a systems person, and then the 4 cornerstones. And I really urge people, it's called Changing Our Story, Changing Our Lives. And of course, the story doesn't change until we change all 4 cornerstones. So it's at centerforpartnership.org, and that would be a start.
Wonderful, wonderful. We definitely make use of that. Great. I would like to say thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and for your spirit and your wisdom. I think it is highly appreciated. Thank you.
I thank you. And it's up to us. I think Margaret Mead said it. She said, all the good things that we take for granted, you know, like child labor laws and, you know, everything, it was due to a very small group of women and men, usually unpopular ones.
Exactly. That actually did the job of changing the world.
Our job. It's our job, because you can't just work on yourself. I mean, it's like trying to go up on a down elevator, really, in a rigid domination system. And so we have to change the system. But changing consciousness.
Absolutely.
Changing worldview is the first step.
Exactly. Excellent. Bring the inner journey and the outer journey together and change the world.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.